Hello, this is your host, Todd Lewis of the Presify podcast. I'm joined again by Master Sanders to finish our series on living biblically and what we can do right now before anything else fundamentally changes. And now we're here to talk about the church. And there's quite a few places we can start, but probably the best place to start is the preaching of the gospel. The first thing that churches and pastors can do right now that they're not doing is fearlessly preaching the gospel. Now, when somebody in some sort of context says, we're fearlessly preaching the gospel, as there was so much doublespeak today, it usually means the exact opposite of what they just publicly told you. And they're actually defending some sort of an interest group. And they're making it, quote unquote, a gospel issue rather than actually preaching the gospel. And they're not actually preaching the gospel because it's hard. They risk losing a lot, and they might anger parishioners, and they'll leave, and with them the money that they bring in through tithes. Maybe they'll lose standing. Maybe they'll lose respectability, or maybe now they'll get canceled. I mean, a lot of those things can happen, but that's why Christ said count the cost and make sure that you're, able to, pay the check that you just wrote out. Otherwise, why did you even get involved in this? And ultimately, the root cause of what the church is not doing right, what isn't working, is that the gospel isn't being preached. So, starting with that, what are some of your thoughts, Master Sanders?
I think why you don't really see the gospel preached is because, as part of what you alluded to, we don't know what the gospel is anymore, right? And part of that, especially within recent years, has been clouded a lot, whether intentionally or unintentionally, by the rise of the Young Reformed and Restless movement, or Young Restless and Reformed movement. It's sort of a meme today that just about any given particular popular left-wing social cause is almost a gospel issue in the eyes of the Gospel Coalition, which is perhaps one of the leading mouthpieces of the Young Restless and Reformed movement. But I think a lot of this confusion came down to the nature of the gospel. I would say within a Calvinist worldview, the gospel is almost a statement, right? It's God working through history for his glory, and he elects those that he wants to be saved, and the rest either directly by choice or by implication by not choosing them are damned to hell. So the gospel is a statement as opposed to the idea that the gospel is an invitation, whereas people who are invited to listen to the gospel receive the gift of salvation and to be changed through the power of the Holy Spirit to a life of sanctification. And I think this sort of confusion as to what the purpose of, or what the gospel is, a statement rather than a invitation, has led to fewer and fewer popular preachers really talking about the gospel. Again, we probably say the word gospel more than any other time, it seems like, in evangelical history, because it's a popular buzzword, especially with a lot of YRR Calvinist organizations. But I think I'm not quite sure why I would say you don't see actual gospel preaching. I think in large part of it is, as you said, it's not particularly popular. But also there's the sort of distraction of dominionism has cut a lot into what the gospel actually means as well. Because for people like TGC, who may not be theonomist or on the right in that sense, nevertheless, they hold a lot of dominionist presuppositions that Christians are called to cultural engagement and changing the culture in the name of Jesus. And this is sort of incorporated into the gospel, which is not prevalent at all in the New Testament as to the purpose of what Christians are called to do. So I think in part you don't see the preaching of the gospel is in large part because we don't know what the word gospel is. We don't know if it's a declaration or if it's an invitation. And oftentimes it's confused with worldly, political, or cultural projects. I think that's in large part why you see that today.
Yeah, exactly. And moving from that starting point, there's a lot of things that we could discuss. But let's start with the one that seems to be on everybody's mind for the last 10 years, the increasingly aging singles population in the church, both male and female. Whether it's the TGC, with Kevin DeYoung's, bro, where's your wife, to, Doug Wilson on the more right-wing end of the spectrum complaining about these singles. What needs to be done is there needs to be an honest discussion of what are the factors involved. And the church can and should have these honest discussions. First of all, it's not just one sex, the male sex, which is involved in this. There's two. And for some reason, the other sex never gets mentioned, even though it's pretty obvious how we can see the behavior of the second sex affecting this. I mean, you wonder why you have aging singles when you tell women to go to college, get a career, and go on foreign mission trips. And, they spend 10, 12 years doing that from, say, 16 to 30? Yeah. That's going to lead to an aging singles problem, regardless of what the men are doing. And so, honestly talking about that, which then gets into the roles of women and what the Bible says about that, which, even in the 1940s and 50s, when C.S. Lewis was talking about mere Christianity, he pointed out that Christian teaching on the roles of women was unpopular even then. So how much more so would it be now? But again, it's within their power to preach that message. They can say and do that. Also, marriages used to be a lot easier. If they were not arranged per se, there was a sort of screening method by the local community that really limited down your options. And it's like, look, you got this amount of time to figure it out. Here are your options. Just get her done. And then it happened. Now there's so many options and there's no deadline. Least of all for women, there's no deadline. So you can just keep waiting and waiting. And guess what? People keep waiting. I mean, that's what they do. Starting a family was a lot easier when you had dowries. You had a lot of upfront money cost, especially if you want people to get married young. You can't have people get married young and then expect them to be already established and successful. It's an oxymoron. When you're young, you're obviously not established and successful. And if you're waiting for people to become established and successful before they get married, well, that's also going to push the age group up. So the church should honestly talk about these issues in their interplay. The church should also, since it has a lot of resources, financial resources, should redirect them from unaccountable institutions like mission boards and parachurch organizations, which, as we've mentioned in other contexts, have been completely failure, and start plowing it back into the community, giving money to young couples to help them start families, start family businesses, to get them, starting rather than having them be, late bloomers or false starts. So honestly talk about the factors that are involved in delayed singleness, aging singles. Create a sort of social and financial environment where it is feasible for young people to start families rather than the one we have now where you really have to wait till you're, at least as a man, till you're in your 30s. And teach that Christian women should not be pursuing careers, college, and foreign missions, and instead should be pursuing godly men to form families with, if forming families is such a big part of their message. So there's a bit there. So why don't we hear your thoughts on that, Master Sanders?
Well, I think the bigger problem is that the church has become more reflective of the world than standing in opposition to it. A lot of the cultural problems that exist in the world, such as fewer and fewer people getting married, a lot more sexual deviation and dysfunction, both inside and outside of marriage. These things are prevalent in the world and are only getting worse. But the sad thing is that they've leaked into the churches, and quite a few, especially the younger people, are caught up in some of these things, in large part because that's what the world's doing, but also the church has sort of an inadequate response to these problems that seem to be based on a paradigm that may have worked a couple of decades ago, but don't seem to have any particular relevance or effectiveness in the present. But again, I think the bigger issue is actually the sort of Pharisaism that you see from the churches. A lot of these churches, as you said, whether they're on the quote-unquote left or right wing of the broader Calvinist sphere, and you can say this of evangelicaldom in general as well, is this idea, the sort of Pharisaism. And I say that because Jesus in the Gospels said, woe to you Pharisees who put all these burdens on the people and not lift a finger to help them. Which again, most of these burdens came out of tradition and not from anything scriptural. And so a lot of these things regarding what marriage is, what uh, how to live and to thrive as an American male or even an American female, some of these are stemmed from tradition and from cultural practice, not from the Bible. But especially for young men, they have the burden that's placed on them by many of their leaders, such as Doug Wilson, that tell their young men to get married, to man up, but they rarely, if ever, offer them anything practical outside of some vague boomeristic advice, or they don't help them at all in trying to achieve these ends, either by helping them actively in the process of selecting a mate from within the church, or by admonishing certain sectors of the church, such as young women or even older couples, for making things difficult for young men to marry. So whether or not you think that marriage is a good thing or something that should be pursued as an end by every Christian is another debate entirely. But if you are going to insist upon that, I think churches would do a lot better to actually help people attain those goals rather than just simply put another burden on their back that many of them cannot live up to just based on the realities of our current age.
Exactly. And I think directly related to that is one thing churches can and should do is honestly discuss what the biblical norms for women are. Because, you've already mentioned this confusion of gender roles, of sexuality in the broader world and how it's leaking into the church. Well, just a cursory reading of some of the New Testament passages like 1 Corinthians 7, 1 Corinthians 11, 1 Peter chapter 3, 1 Timothy chapter 2, and what they have to say about women, 1 Timothy chapter 5, they never discuss at all. And it's like, well, this is actually very important, right? So a related theme is the debate amongst quote unquote conservative circles over whether head covering is long hair or a covering. And, in the 90s and early 2000s, the argument was, well, it was long hair. But now that, you go to any church and women have, dyke haircuts and look indistinguishable from secular women. And it's like, they never meant that. They never even meant that long hair was a covering. It was just a canard. They were not honestly dealing with the issue. And if the question then is, well, where are you getting your ideals for how women ought to live and behave? Are you getting it from the world or are you getting it from the gospel? And they won't. Now, we know why they won't say that. Because they're afraid of the repercussions, whatever that might be, whether that's financial, whether that's career, whether that's prestige, regardless. But that has to happen because we have to understand in the church what men and women do and what men and women are for. And, to take, say, the more conservative stance on the head covering issue, fewer and fewer churches are willing to do that. And I would argue that if you look at all other things being equal and you look at that one trend of getting rid of hats and head coverings to just having long hair, to then cutting the hair, to then getting to where we're at now, that's one of the most important indicators of where the church is moving in the direction is bad or not. Because I can't think of any church that hasn't gone in that direction that hasn't become a dumpster fire. And so that's one thing that the church needs to address and can address even now.
Well, and I'd say you're right. And again, the biggest problem is not necessarily just the issue of gender, but these issues of gender stem, again, from changes in the world, not just culturally, but also economically as well. I don't think we really appreciate how, for lack of a better word, how aberrant, I guess, or, that the modern world is in comparison to the rest of human history. The nuclear family, even in and of itself, is quite new, relatively speaking, or at least as Americans understand it, which in times past and almost across cultures, you typically had a multi-generational aspect of family. And while certain roles might vary and there might be some nuances here or there, I would say most cultures, though not all, most cultures at one stage or another were predominantly patriarchal. There's some that may have had matriarchal elements, some that may have had more egalitarian elements. But for the general rule, that's part of what it is, part of what human history was. So in the present day, it's difficult to look at the ethical norms as prescribed in the New Testament, even as countercultural as they were to a degree against the Greco-Roman world of Paul's day. It's kind of hard to see that a lot of the things that we take for granted regarding gender or even regarding money and other aspects as being the norm, or as being fitting with the New Testament understanding of ethics and roles, than not. And so, for example, the reason why that feminism, I think, has been able to creep so much into the church has not really been a full frontal assault by feminists on the church, at least within the conservative church, maybe within the mainline liberal churches. But if you look at, for example, more conservative churches, let's say like Doug Wilson and his group, I would say the more implicit feminism has to do more with money than it does with just feminism. So, in order to maintain a lifestyle, a certain lifestyle in America, you have to have a certain level of income, and that is becoming increasingly difficult to do so on one person's income. So more and more homes have actually had to have both parents working to one degree or another, in large part because of this reality. And even if a lot of people, even those that I know, women who would reject the label of feminist and would recoil at such a label because of its connotation, nevertheless live lifestyles that are not too dissimilar from ideals advocated by feminists simply because of monetary realities. And so as the church has allowed itself to be dictated by current economic trends rather than standing against them or presenting an alternative to them, feminism and other ideas have been able to sneak in through the back door, so to speak. And that's why even these more quote-unquote conservative churches won't support things like, for a woman covering her head or a woman remaining exclusively a homemaker or anything to that degree, simply because those things would have a greater economic impact and could cause a lot of monetary loss that many of these people are just not willing to suffer.
Yeah, exactly. And really, this is something that we've talked about in private before. It really is this love of money that is really the core of the issue here. And so many churches, well, what's basically ended up happening is that the model of the seeker-sensitive megachurch, which makes lots of money for its pastors and its elders, has sort of metastasized and become the universal model for everybody. Even people that used to criticize that model, say, for example, John MacArthur, have, except for like the cringy elements of a Joel Osteen, have adopted the basic mechanics of the model. And what ends up happening is that whenever a decision has to be made, whenever a decision is made, you can generally be sure that the way in which that decision was made or solved or what considerations ultimately carried the weight was money. Was it profitable? Would you lose too much money if you did it? And with that in mind, that's in part why a lot of this is happening. And, Christ says that one's worth does not consist in the number of one's possessions. Do not lay up treasure on earth where moth and rust destroy, but lay it up in heaven. And, it's all in the Bible. Everybody knows this. But like so many, especially conservative Christians, but even liberal Christians, someone like a Tim Keller, right? Arguably, in some sense, they should know better because they've sort of cornered the market on the critique of capitalism argument. And even they fail to point this out. Is that, this entire system of generating profit and money is not consistent with, the gospel. And in fact, if you look at, say, Samuel's sons, they sort of skimmed off the top of what was given to God, the best meat that was offered for sacrifice, and skimming from the temple treasury, or Judas skimming from the donations to Christ, a lot of our modern day church leaders ended up being essentially Judases and, the sons of Samuel.
Well, exactly. And even, well, for example, I'll give you an example. This past month, with the report on Ravi Zacharias dropping, I think within a lot of the reform sphere, that took up a lot of attention in the away from another drop that was made around the same time by Julie Royce about the financial empire, so to speak, of Grace to You and Master Seminary and Grace Community Church. And in many ways, while MacArthur has, as you point out, been very critical of the prosperity gospel, in many ways he doesn't live that too dissimilar from many who are in that sphere, including 3 home properties. And even now, his son was put under investigation for monetary issues associated with his time with Grace to You. MacArthur himself had to resign from the board well, not the board, but he had to resign as president of Master Seminary in large part because there were critiques from the accreditation agency saying that there was a level of conflict of interest in issues of independence, which even then he seems to have made a considerable amount of money for the amount of work that he logged in. And so outside of my issues with MacArthur on soteriology and other things, MacArthur is not, in the largest sense of the word, a heretic. In fact, when it comes to a lot of his ideas, I think he's actually probably one of the fewer saner voices within the broader Reformed movement, those that haven't become woke or those that haven't become theonomous light. But at the same time, though, the fact that he has made so much money and for something that, I don't know, I guess in light of what you were saying about what we should do, and not just only making the money, that would be one thing, but obviously he is living a lifestyle that would be quite expensive, as taxes are quite expensive in California, I would assume, especially for property taxes. But it's with this kind of lifestyle does make you wonder, how many other people in the ministry are actually in this for the money. And what the thing is with money, once it becomes a factor, it does tie you down to certain things, and it does keep you from being, I think, more bold when it comes to criticizing certain issues. Going back to, let's say, Doug Wilson. Doug Wilson has this reputation for being a firebrand, for being, for lack of a better word, more patriarchal. If you read his comments, you can kind of see why people would think that. But for the other hand, he actively recruits women for New St. Andrews College. He actively counter signals even some of the best of well, not the best, but other patriarchists, even some of his own friends like Doug Phillips, when he criticized the Quiverful movement by saying, we shouldn't be stud farms. But nevertheless, even so, he really couldn't be as bold as he can be on certain issues because of the issue of money. Even these people who are not quote unquote feminist or egalitarians have to keep their mouths shut on certain issues because a lot of their money is tied into trying to appeal to women to go to their seminaries or to take their programs, or just simply not to offend the sensibilities of those within their congregation. So money, arguably more than any other factor within the church, has caused a lot of the problems that we see today in the church, and getting away from living not only preaching the gospel, but living a sanctified life, which you see fewer and fewer people actually preach about today.
Well, exactly. And I think there are really 4 sort of stories that really are in the New Testament, 4 teachings that really just need to be said because nobody says them. So first is the story of the rich young ruler in Matthew 19. Now, behold, one came and said to him, "Good teacher, what good thing shall I do that I may have eternal life?" So he said to them, "Why do you call me good? No one is good but one, that is God. But if you want to enter into life, keep the commandments." He said to him, "Which ones?" Jesus said, "You shall not murder, you shall not commit adultery, you shall not steal, you shall not bear false witness, honor your father and your mother, and you shall love your neighbor as yourself." The young man said to him, "All these things I have kept from my youth. What still do I lack?" Jesus said to him, if you want to be perfect, go sell what you have and give to the poor, and you'll have treasure in heaven, and come follow me. But when the young man heard that saying, he went away sorrowful, for he had great possessions. Now, what's interesting about this passage is this is not a wicked sinner. This is a man who is perfect according to the law. Jesus doesn't say, oh, well, no, you're lying. You actually didn't keep all these things. No, he admits, he concedes the point that this young man kept all these teachings, except that the young man loved money, which Christ says you can't serve God and mammon. And in Luke 19, with the story of Zacchaeus, when Zacchaeus comes to repentance, it says, verses 8, 9, and 10, then Zacchaeus stood and said to the Lord, look, Lord, I give half of my goods to the poor, and if I have taken anything from anyone by false accusation, I restore fourfold. And Jesus said to him, today salvation has come to this house, because he is also a son of Abraham, for the Son of Man has come to seek and save which was lost. So Christ associates salvation, repentance, coming with restitution, and coming with selling your goods to the poor. Then Acts 2, verse 44, now all who believed were together, had all things in common, and sold their possessions and goods, and divided them among those as they had need. And then Acts chapter 4, verse 32, now the multitude of those who believed were of one heart and soul. Neither did anyone say that any of these things he possessed was his own, but they had all things in common. Now, in private, we've talked about this before. Well, one might be forgiven for thinking that Jesus was a socialist, because on a very, very superficial level, there seems to be some sort of congruity. It really is a patently absurdity to view Christ as defender of the property class or the wealthy or capitalism or anything like that. And then these passages just don't get preached on, or they get contextualized into non-existence. And that just has to stop, because if you take these seriously, it's going to be really hard. That's why no one talks about it seriously or honestly, because it is hard. But of course, doing that hard thing, according to both Zacchaeus and the rich young ruler, was a salvation issue. To go all TGC on you, it's a salvation issue. And Zacchaeus made the right choice. And so what the church can and should do is, again, preach the gospel with regard to wealth.
Well, and one note on the rich young ruler before I move on to the next point. You often hear in reference to the rich young ruler that, like, oh, well, he obviously wasn't really or telling the truth, because we've all broken the law at one point or another. Well, the problem is that Jesus, as you mentioned, he assumes that he's telling the truth. He says you only lack one thing, and the only thing that you lack is to give away all that you have and sell what you have, give to the poor, and follow me. And so I think the real issue is that even though he could theoretically keep the law, the real issue is that of the heart and what one believes. What one values, what one worships. And for him, obviously, the thing that he worshipped was money, even though he theoretically kept the law. And even, of course, Jesus follows that with it's easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter the kingdom of heaven. Now, he doesn't say it's impossible, because through God all things are possible. But wealth is presented throughout the Gospels, and even, I would say, throughout the writings of Paul and James especially, that wealth is a detriment. It's a barrier to salvation. It's a barrier to sanctification. It makes things harder because it ties you to reality, to this world, and gives you the illusion that you're secure when you're not. For example, you have the man who tore down his barns to build bigger barns, and yet he died that night. His wealth wasn't enough to save his life. But going on to sort of the bigger picture here, I think one of the biggest problems within the church is part of the embracing of money, or at least a willingness to not really touch the issue of money, is because church structures are built in such a way as to necessitate a constant flow of money. Things like parachurch organizations, things like seminaries and schools, both grade school and college. All these additional denominational structures, mission boards, all these things which might have some nice practical purposes are ultimately not prescribed in Scripture, and are ultimately not necessary for the church to truly carry out what it needs to. And so I tend to think that a lot of this drive within the church, whether it was the seeker-sensitive movement or the church growth movement, or some of these other things to appear culturally relevant, have really been a method of just maintaining the money flow in many of these churches and denominations that especially need it. So the COVID issue has been a real interesting situation for the church, because you have, at least superficially, a lot of the mega churches that tend to be a little more liberal are more likely to close as opposed to the ones that are more conservative. But also a lot of these churches, and some of them which I know that are in my neighborhood, have applied for federal aid in the wake of closing their churches, which I think, especially if these are Baptist churches doing this, that traditional Baptist predecessors going back in the 18th century, those who were persecuted by the Virginia established church, would have balked at that, especially when they had the opportunity to gain money from the Virginia government as a method of trying to preserve the establishment of religion. But also you have these other churches, people like Doug Wilson, but also people like John MacArthur, that have insisted on keeping their churches open, ostensibly appealing to Hebrews, but I think in light of other aspects of that passage as well, and as well as looking at their organizations, it seems to be that they want to keep their churches open in order to keep the money flowing so they can maintain the very high overhead that they have. And so one thing that the church could do, I think, to truly cast off the chains that money places on them, is to fundamentally rethink their structure. And I think a lot of that would have to do would involve giving up a lot of sacred cows, a lot of parachurch organizations, mission boards, denominational structures, all these other institutions and facilities would need to be discarded. I think if the church is going to free itself from the desire to have as much money as they do. So yeah, again, as the specter of money and organization, I think is what's going to keep the churches from being as effective as they can, even though it seems like they enable the church to do more, but in reality, it hampers the church and what kind of message it can preach, as we've mentioned, gender being one example.
Yeah, and touching back on the parachurch organizations and these more national and global structures, is the money that the church has needs to be spent locally, firstly on the congregation itself. The church is supposed to be a mutual aid society on a sociological level. It's supposed to take care of the material needs of its members. John says, if you just say, be warm and be filled, your faith is worthless. You've got to give food and clothes to a starving and naked brother or sister in Christ. But, I guess we have more important ministries to support. So we're not going to give money to those. Well, that will create dependency. We can't do that. Something that's never actually mentioned in the gospel in the New Testament is the sin of dependency. It's never mentioned anywhere. And like so many other faux sins like racism, sexism, statism, whatever. It's not mentioned in the gospel at all. Now, so what the churches can and should do is just start spending money locally. Because we also have an accountability crisis. You mentioned people like Ravi Zacharias, on the right, and on the left, you had Bill Hybels from Willow Creek. You have an accountability crisis. And part of the reason is the money is being spent in an unaccountable way, being given to unaccountable institutions. If you spend money locally on people that you ostensibly see every week, you can have oversight. It's accountable. You can avoid a lot of these tragedies because there's people that are involved in this process and you're on top of it. Whereas, if somebody's in, Colorado Springs, how are you going to know what they're up to? You're not. They're on a mission trip in India. How do you know what they're up to? You're not. And it's this crisis of accountability, which is in part because the church is thinking globally. We're never called to save the world. Christ will do that. We're never called to save everybody because we also know that, unfortunately, most people will reject the gospel of Christ. But we don't know who those people are who will reject. So we have to evangelize as many people as we can, but we can't save everybody. And so you can't save the world. It's not possible. You can't save everybody. It's not possible. We mentioned this in another context with regards, I think it was to family. People are full of angst, anxiety, and fear because they are working for goals that cannot actually ever be achieved. And the church needs to be honest and tell them that you can't do these things. You can't do these things not because necessarily they're forbidden. They may or may not be. You can't do them because in principle they're impossible tasks. And the church needs to be honest and tell people about that. And tell them, assign to them tasks that are commanded in Scripture, that are attainable, that will encourage people and get them out of this funk of despair and fear and uncertainty. Which they could easily do that tomorrow by focusing on the local community, making sure that everybody's taken care of. If somebody's got financial issues, you help take care of that. If you got some young people that really ought to have been married a while ago, you can help them with that. Just start solving these local issues. Because they are local, you'll actually be able to fix them. So think locally. Stop thinking globally. That's another thing the church can do immediately.
Well, and going back to the sort of cottage industry that is parachurch organizations, I think it was amazing just the depths of depravity we found out that Ravi Zacharias was involved in. Not just simply, I guess, a sin of impulse, where I think a lot of us, even the best of us, are subject to. But in many ways, it was just like deliberate calculation, abuse, having an apartment in Bangkok about 3 miles away from the red light district, things like that. And what's scary about that is that there were probably a lot of well-meaning Christians over the years that donated to that organization because they believed that Ravi Zacharias and his apologetics work and debating this person and talking about that thing was doing something that was going to help Christians take over the culture, win the culture war on some level. The fact is that that's not how it works, and I think that some people like Zacharias or maybe just be the tip of the iceberg. I think there's probably a lot more within Big Eva, so to speak, regardless of what flavor it is, that we likely don't know. And the thing is that the gravy train is going to crash one day. It's going to derail simply because I think the federal government will likely find a way to remove tax-exempt status from these organizations by saying many of these organizations are just using it to justify their bad behavior. People like the Southern Baptist Convention is trying to argue religious liberty when it came to wrongfully terminating an employee. Well, maybe not. That wasn't quite the issue, but for spreading rumors that led to the loss of his employment, or Ravi Zacharias, or John MacArthur and his millions, and these things. Again, the federal government is going to, I think, crack down on this, at least here in the United States. So the best thing that Christians can do is to again scale down significantly and try to wean themselves off of dependence on these large organizations, which in the end don't do anything, which in the end haven't done a whole lot for Christians. If these people want to have some level of fulfillment in doing what they've been called to do by God, they would do a lot better by just simply raking the leaves off of an elderly church member's lawn, or cleaning out their gutters, or helping somebody who's in a financial strait that's in their church, far more than they could funding what amounts to sex tourism on the other side of the world, or reprobates who use their reputation to prey on women. So the thing is, there's a lot of things we could do that does not, in terms of fulfilling our call as Christians, that doesn't involve relying on some large, unaccountable organization to do that work for us.
Well, yeah, exactly. And I see you mentioned dependency there, which that's the irony, right? All of this attempt to not do things in the name of not creating dependency has itself made Christians and the churches dependent on other things that aren't God or Christ or his teaching. And, we can look at, the motivations, whether they were good or not. I mean, obviously people change over time. And I think some of these people were bad from the beginning and some of them did change over time. But if we look at Focus on the Family, I mean, it's a total failure. Christian families are worse off now than when Focus on the Family was started. So whether it was bad intentions or good intentions with a bad system, it didn't work. And it still doesn't work. And really, the church isn't poor. Unfortunately, there's an embarrassment of riches in the church. It's just that certain people get all the money and certain people don't get any of it. And with the overall rising cost of living in society as a whole, especially with regards to marriage becoming more and more expensive financially, it leaves a lot of people behind. And if anything is the case in the church, is that nobody gets left behind. I mean, that's one of the selling points of the church to the broader world for people to come in. Nobody gets left behind. Now, that does run the risk of grifters and bad actors sneaking in, but it's ultimately what gave Christianity its ability to defeat the Roman Empire. Julian the Apostate commented on how the Christians took care of each other and nobody was left behind. And he thought, well, that's what he as a pagan emperor had to tackle head on in order to save the old gods. And he tried to create his own state pagan healthcare services, and it totally failed. But he was intelligent enough and had enough foresight to see that was what one of the key strengths of the church was, that was undermining the authority of the old gods of Rome. And so you could argue today, why would anybody join a church today? Which, unfortunately, that's a very good question. We also hear nonstop, pews are empty, aging church congregations, fewer and fewer people are in the church. Church leaders, pastors are at an all-time low with regards to cultural influence. Despite all the pressure to exert cultural influence, the influence of pastors is at an all-time low. Respect is at an all-time low. It's hard to believe that, 100, 150 years ago, pastors, theologians were considered intellectuals on par with philosophers, mathematicians, and inventors. Jonathan Edwards, for example, would have been in the same category as, Euler, the Swiss mathematician. He was a great intellectual, recognized by society as such. Thinking today of a pastor as a great intellectual is almost a bad joke today. And it's because they aren't. And that's a big reason why they don't have influence. And the other thing is, if you are a young person, because again, we're dealing with the empty pews, the aging church, there's nothing in it for young people. I mean, obviously one shouldn't become a Christian merely for self-interested reasons, but the church doesn't offer anything. The problems that they're struggling with, the millennial generation, the Zoomer generation, the church has literally nothing to say and nothing to help address it. And again, what the church could start doing now is addressing these issues that affect millennials and Zoomers in a way that nobody else does. Because if you look at the nation as a whole, nobody is addressing these issues. So to use, use a capitalist term, they could corner the market on solving the boomer or the millennial Zoomer problem. And they're not doing it. And pastors really need to just step up. They've fallen so far. There was a joke in the 90s, long before the alphabet soup transgender crowd, that there were three sexes, male, female, and pastor. And so, this is a far cry from, being a peer of a philosopher or being a peer of a mathematician. And again, churches could start now dealing with those problems as well.
Well, the thing is that, well, first of all, let me back up a little bit, going back to the issue of the gospel. There's a phrase, I believe, that was attributed to St. Francis about, let's see, it was preach the gospel at all times, if necessary, use words. Now, in recent years, that quote is sort of seized on by certain evangelicals and ridiculed, which I one analogy I heard was that, like, well, it's as if feed everyone, and if necessary, use food, right? But there's something to this idea. Jesus talks about in the Sermon on the Mount, let your light so shine before men that men may see your good works and praise your Father which is in heaven. Jesus also says in the Gospels that they will know you are my disciples if you love one another. So the idea that the gospel is in part preached through action is demonstrated, or at least referred to, in the Gospels and in the Old Testament itself. It's not just simply what you preach; it's how you live as well. And even if the church were to produce great intellectuals that were on par with such giants of the past, the problem is that the world has no reason to listen to them. There's no reason to listen to most of these pastors because they're hypocrites. They're not. They live rather bourgeois, middle class lifestyles, and so they're not really that different from most other Americans. So, other than being a holy roller, why should I listen to them? And it's not just pastors; it's Christians in general, right? And so Christians don't really distinguish themselves in their behavior, not just by the fact that they are, well, in large part because they are hypocrites. The Karen meme is in large part depicted as a Christian, and sadly enough, there's a lot of truth to that. So there's the reason why the world doesn't listen to the church in the church's ever futile quest for relevance in the world today is because there's no reason to. There's no reason to listen to pastors. There's no reason to listen to Christians in general, because they don't live lifestyles that are compelling, and they don't really offer a message that's compelling, because not only do they live lifestyles that are just similar to the world, but also they, in some cases, live lifestyles that are even worse than the world. So even if we're going to, claim that like some level of cultural engagement is necessary for the Christian, we don't really provide the world a lot of, I don't know, we don't provide the world a level of compelling evidence for them to listen to us in any case, regardless of what we're trying to do.
Exactly. And I guess since we're nearing the end, the thing that we can sort of end with is consistency. The church can give a consistent, principled message rather than giving messages based on convenience or pulling the room or trying to make more money. They can make principled stands even when it hurts. And I would agree that a lot of the critics that I've heard of Christianity from the outside are often it's hypocrisy, it's inconsistency. There was this Calvinist podcaster I used to listen to a few years ago by the name of Kevin Swanson, and he was telling a story of a police officer friend of his who was a Christian, who they had to bust this guy for having child pornography, and it turned out this guy was a pastor. And the other police officer on the force said, see, you know better than we are. And I'm like, well, unfortunately, a lot of Christians have given room for that kind of a sentiment. Now, we also need to be clear that even in ancient times, there were people that called themselves Christians, like i.e. the Gnostics, who lived in a very sensual manner that was corrupt and immoral. And they were called Christians by the Romans because it was easier to attack them than to attack the real Christians. So that's always going to be the case. So I'm not really saying anything about that per se. It's who do you point to who's not doing that? That's the real question. And in the first century, you could say, well, yeah, those aren't real Christians, and here's why. And you can point to the real Christians over here living this way. Today, it's not really easy to do. That's not to say there aren't people like that, but they're, to sort of quote Elrond from the Fellowship of the Ring film, they're leaderless, scattered, and divided. And that's a big problem. So I think consistently applying the gospel, consistently applying biblical principles is really what we need to see.
Exactly. And you see this charge again from conservatives in politics, where the left seems to get away with so much, and when the right does anything remotely similar, they get jumped on for it. Yeah, that's true. But the thing is that in theory, conservatives are supposed to have a greater moral compass than the left, which they depict as degenerates. Now, whether or not that's true is another story, but nevertheless, that's the perception, or that's the expectation. And likewise, Christians are called to have a higher standard of themselves and not to partake in the world, not to partake in the activities of the world or hold the same values as the world. And when we fail, even if it's not on the same level as the world does, we become a laughing stock. Because again, in theory, we should have a better worldview than that. We should have a better, consistent application of what we believe than that. So, again, we're called by Jesus to live differently from the world. Jesus makes a constant comparison between us and the Gentiles, or us and the world. That we're supposed to be better than that. We're supposed to be different from that. We are to reflect who our master is by the way we live our lives, by how we conduct ourselves, what we talk about, how we treat each other, how we treat the brethren, and not just people on the outside, but how we treat the brethren. And it's through this collective witness of consistently following what Christ has told us to do, both how we treat each other, how we treat our enemies. It's as well as through preaching of the gospel through words, through the spoken word. That's how we win those in a lost and dying world, not through attempts to compromise with the world, not attempts to pander to the world, not attempts to top the world in the sense of that we can do the same thing you do, albeit much better. It's not by trying to provide another pillar for the world by saying that, well, we can actually provide you an intellectual basis for what you already believe. Rather, our witness stands from the position of how different we are from the world. And once that becomes apparent, the world may hate us, the world may love us, but nevertheless, it's through this consistent witness that we actually can begin to win some people to Christ.
Well, all right. Thanks again, Master Sanders. This is Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast, signing off.